Okay, let's get going here. Hello, everyone. Again, thanks again for joining us today. My name is Jason Larson, and I'm the head of content and marketing here at the International Institute for Analytics, and I'm your host for today's session. And welcome to today's webinar, making the case analytics ROI with the returned business value lens. All right, in case you're new to the International Institute for Analytics, or IIA, as we typically call ourselves, we are an independent, strategic, outcome-focused data and analytics advisory firm. We're practitioners working with practitioners. Analytics is all we do, and we do it with a relentless focus on measurable impact. Visit our homepage for more information about who we are and how we support data and analytics leaders in making the difficult and necessary transition to advanced analytics and AI. And Ryan, if you could show the slides, that would be great here for the opening. So before we dive into the presentation, let's go over a few housekeeping items. First, it's last call to register for IIA's Analytics Symposium in Pittsburgh, October 29th and 30th. The theme for this year is Bridging Foundations and Frontiers. The team has put together an excellent agenda, a very interactive, networking rich day. Join us for Highmark Health's Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer's perspective on the role of analytics in enterprise transformation. Boeing's Enterprise Gen AI Journey Story, which is a great one. We'll have some IIA expert frameworks on AI use case prioritization and end-to-end implementation, along with discussions on responsible AI, federated analytics operating models, MDM, and data governance, and ROI, among other topics. Speaking of ROI, for today's session, we encourage you to submit questions or comments via the chat window, and we'll make sure to save time at the end of the session to address as many questions as possible. The dialogue and questions that you bring to the table add tremendous value to these sessions. It makes you an active participant. It brings some energy to the speakers. Don't be shy. Converse as a group in the comments, share resources, send us your questions. That level of engagement really generates more takeaways for us all. A recorded version of this webinar and slides will be available after the presentation. All right, so without further ado, we are delighted to welcome Marc Demarest as our featured speaker today. Marc is an expert and principal at Numinal, a consulting firm specializing in intellectual capital development. He's hailed as the father of data marting, and through the years, he's advised IIA clients on the spectrum of enterprise analytics challenges. Marc's perspective really sharpens our point of view on measuring and communicating the value of enterprise analytics in IIA's returned business value framework, which is we consider a corrective to conventional ROI models. The return business value framework is really built on three pillars: strategic value, commercial value, and risk mitigation. Gluing it all together is the belief that ROI is not a math problem. In fact, traditional finance models tend to break down when you apply them to analytics projects, many of which are nonlinear or experimental and informed by anecdotes and qualitative data. Finance math wasn't built for the way analytics creates value. Finance math undervalues analytics. And IIA believes value is not really what you model. It's what the business realizes, internalizes, and sustains. And as the adoption of AI accelerates, the gap between delivered and realized value is only growing. So today, Marc is going to explore two important assumptions underpinning IIA's return business value framework. First, there needs to be a change in thinking. Analytics leaders have to start thinking and talking in terms of bets. And there needs to be a change in process. Analytics leaders have to forecast, deliver, measure, explain, and correct their bets. So by the end of this session, we'll be thinking and talking in strategic bets, which in our view is priority number one in setting the stage for analytics value. All right, before I hand the mic over to Marc, we'd like to extend a free 30-minute follow-on consultation with Marc for those who are new to IIA. Take advantage of the offer to discuss pressing and specific problems with him. You won't be disappointed. Use the QR code actually, the QR code is not on the screen. We're having issues with the slides, but we'll drop a link in the chat. Apologies for that. To schedule this free 30-minute consultation. A member of our team, Jack Taylor, will help facilitate that call. For current IIA Research and Advisory Network clients, you can and should schedule hour-long sessions with Marc and other experts in our network to assist you with top-of-mind challenges. One-on-one expert consultations are a key part of your service, and our experts are waiting in the wings to help you. Contact the research and advisory team to set up those sessions. All right, that's enough of me. Okay, Mark, I'll let you take it from here, my friend.
All right, so let me see if I can defeat the technology problem and share my screen. Can people see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. So thanks for giving us your time today, everybody. This seems to be a general domain in which many folks are wrestling with knotty problems around cost justification or return business value. I certainly have a lot of these conversations with folks these days, particularly around aspects of deep learning and generative AI. And so I want to start by giving you a couple of caveats. One is everybody's looking for an easy button here. How do I cost justify one or another sunk technology cost in the face of resistance or skepticism from business beneficiaries, general management, whoever it might be? I won't be giving you an easy button today because there isn't one as far as I know. I've struggled with this problem set for as long as I've been in the business. And as I'll suggest to you today, doing good measurement of return to business value is a matter of process and a matter of nuance. The second thing people often ask me for is a model for a particular cost justification problem, which is both simple and defensible. And unfortunately, from my perspective, that's a bit of a binary opposition. You can have a model that's defensible, or you can have a model that's simple, but you can't have both. It is possible to build good defensible return business value models and then abstract them into simplicity. But again, this is a lot about nuance. This problem, the problem of how we justify technology spend, has been with us for a very long time, certainly as long as I've been doing technology. Even in the very early days, when the kind of tech we were most interested in deploying were things we would now refer to as office automation, the justification for doing those sorts of things, for deploying tools that we now consider to be an every desktop item and part of the infrastructure, the justification there was productivity, improved productivity. And we deployed multiple generations of office automation tools and failed in every case to detect the deployment of that technology in general productivity statistics. We've always been in a situation where we make technology investments, but we can't measure return on that investment empirically. And in significant measure, that's the result of some historical problems we've had. You know, the notion of being able to connect a project with top level economic indicators goes all the way back to the 1940s, and a guy named John Jacob Raskob, whose claims to fame are twofold. One, he was simultaneously the CFO of General Motors and DuPont, which that's a pretty significant activity. And two, he built the Empire State Building. But Raskob realized that it was very hard for operational leaders to connect their work with the income statement. And so he decomposed the income statement 3 or 4 levels deep into a series of pressure points or project areas that could be demonstrated to materially change in a positive way some element of the income statement or other. And you know, when I got into the biz, people used that income statement decomposition model to essentially frame up their technology projects. But in the early 80s, because so much of tech was hard and was capital intensive, sort of basic financial models sort of took over from that earlier business-oriented way of thinking about impact of technology on commercial performance. And all of a sudden it was about ROI and NPV and internal rate of return and weighted cost of capital. Those financial models came from capital projects. And the capital intensive component of our work has largely dissipated, and yet we continue to use those sorts of models, which are not particularly applicable, to talk about return to business value, to talk about cost justification. In the 90s, this problem was apparent, and some folks who had worked in IT automation in the energy generation industry wrote a pretty important book called Information Economics, which for those of us who were working in the 1990s was sort of the Bible of return to business value. Everything was expressed in terms of the categories in information economics. I still think it's quite relevant and encourage you guys to go out into the secondary market, see if you can find a copy of this book. But information economics suffered from some complexities. It was difficult to explain to the business. And then the next major innovation was in the early 2000s, where Doug Laney and some of his colleagues put together a series of models and methods that are collectively known as infonomics. I'm sure some of you have been exposed to them. If you haven't, it's definitely worth looking at Laney's work, particularly if you work primarily on data products or data assets, as opposed to projects. But I think all of these models ultimately assume that the problem was either merely or primarily mathematical. And I personally do not believe that the cost justification problem is a mathematical problem. If you look at the problem today, it's pretty straightforward. We have a lot of inexact and in some cases inapplicable models. We're trying to employ them at a time of really unprecedented economic and socio-political instability, where every commercial firm is assessing their investments. We have competing uses for what is usually a declining volume of investment. A lot of us are struggling with disenchantment within our organizations with what is now a pretty long history of, for the most part, open loop investments in data and analytics. We spent, but we did not always or even usually go to the trouble of justifying our spend. And maybe this is dissipating, but I'm sure some of you are still working in an environment where there's a lot of enchantment with supply side driven technological novelties, things that are spelled generative AI. Bad case of shiny object syndrome, which can distort all of this, as well as exercise and outsized influence on that competing use for declining investments problem. Newly minted heads of AI joining organizations looking for budgeted spend that they can reallocate to their particular domain. For many of us, one of the first ports of call for these newly minted AI leaders is the data and analytics group. And I think that's a reality that we have to face. I believe that ultimately we're responsible. Data and analytics professionals are responsible for the situation we find ourselves in. We haven't, as a discipline, measured our business value as a matter of course. We've done it when we've had to. In some cases, we've allowed ourselves to become order takers, and order takers don't assess return to business value. Imagine walking up to the counter of a fast food restaurant and ordering a Big King, a large fries, and a 64-ounce Coke, and having the person behind the counter tell you, "You sure you want that? That's an awful lot of calories for somebody your age and your size. Wouldn't you be better off with a garden salad with grilled chicken?" Order takers don't advise. And order takers consequently have very little control over when, whether, and how business value is measured. As Jason mentioned at the outset, my view is pretty simple to express, just hard to do. In order for us to get our arms around cost benefit analyses, however we express that idea, we really need to make two fundamental changes in our discipline. The first is a change in the way we think about projects. We have to start thinking and talking about the projects we undertake in terms of bets. And we have to change our process. We have to forecast each of those bets. We have to deliver on them. We have to measure the effects of the bets. We have to explain the gap between what we forecasted and what we actually measured. And then we have to correct our practice to do a better job in the future. Thinking and talking in bets is not new. Some of you may have been exposed to Annie Duke's book. If you haven't, I encourage you to read it. She didn't invent this idea. The idea was actually invented by Charles Koch when he was the CEO of Koch Industries, which at that time was the largest privately held company in the United States. Charles Koch is, as some of you may know, an extraordinarily well-trained Austrian school economist, in addition to being an amazing business manager. But the basic idea behind thinking about bets is pretty straightforward. The majority of the projects we undertake involve us wagering real value, our employers' money and our employers' resources, in conditions where the outcomes are uncertain, where we lack anything like perfect knowledge, and where we don't control the system within which we're working. Those are bets by definition. The difference between that and casinos or racetracks is that we're playing against ourselves, not against the house. These bets aren't zero sum, and they're a lot more complicated than traditional bet making. We can pretend that that's not the case, and many organizations do pretend that they are not making bets on technology. Or we can embrace the inevitability of these bets and we can become better bet makers. And that's essentially what I'm going to suggest to you today that we need to do. This is worth thinking about. This is Charles Koch himself, who, in addition to being the former head of Koch Industries, is also the father of something called market-based management. If you're not familiar with that term, I encourage you to stick it into your favorite generative AI tool or into your favorite search engine and read a bit about MBM, which is a very interesting idea about how to run organizations, parts of organizations, whether large or small. Confusing as it might seem, failure and getting results are not mutually exclusive. When driving experimental discovery within a company, failure is not desirable, but it should be expected. Sometimes today's positive results can only be derived from lessons of yesterday's failed experiments. By not unduly penalizing well-planned experiments that fail, we fuel an engine of small and frequent bets that can generate powerful discovery and learning. This is vital to innovation, growth, and long-term profitability. Well-planned experiments. If we started thinking about all of the DNA projects that we do as experiments, that is to say, bets that needed to be well planned, and that necessarily, because they're experiments, contained well-formed hypotheses, the ability to measure actual outcomes against those hypotheses, and the ability to analyze the gap between our hypothesis and what is actually empirically measured, we'd immediately be a very long way to getting cost benefit right in most of our projects. So when we're thinking and talking in bets instead of in terms of projects or tickets or whatever the other unit of composition is that we tend to think about, when we're thinking about bets, the big questions are: who owns the definition of the bet? Who owns the outcome? Who wants the bet measured? And how will the results of the bet be measured? So I've given you on this slide on the right an actual bet, a real project that I and a couple of other principals at Numinal undertook a couple of years ago. If we build and deploy a churn model that predicts distributor churn 90 days or so in advance, and we integrate the predictions of that churn model and push-based prescriptive guidance into the Salesforce automation system, our channel managers can reduce unplanned distributor churn by 15%. Since each distributor represents $280,000 a year in bookings to us, that outcome represents retained bookings of 3.6 million for the next fiscal year and avoided costs of recruiting and signing replacement distributors of 650K for the fiscal year. That was the essential bet for the project. It was something that we could articulate to anyone who was curious about the work that we were doing. It was not the model that underpinned that bet. The model was far more complicated because we had to produce a model that was both understandable and inspectable, not only for the beneficiaries, in this case, the vice president of sales and distribution, but also for the chief financial officer. The word can here is underlined because, as I'm going to suggest to you in a minute, no matter how good a job we do as technologists building data and analytics products that deliver value, insights, whatever we care to call the deliverable, we ultimately depend these days on human beings taking right action. So I'll confess that we built this system, it worked as designed, and we failed to achieve those targets. When we did the analysis on why we failed to achieve the targets, we discovered something we didn't know at the outset, which was the same individuals who were supposed to be taking our prescriptive guidance and preventing churn in the existing distributor portfolio were incented by their sales compensation plan to instead sign up new distributors. And consequently, all of the technologically expensive and complex predictions and push-based descriptive guidance that we were delivering into Salesforce.com was in 8 cases out of 10 being ignored by a group of people who were in effect compensated to do something different. That's not a technological problem, but it is a failure on our part to adequately understand the environment in which we were delivering value. For organizations that have embraced bets, and more are embracing this notion of betting as a management tool, there are some rules, and that is that good bet makers get to make more and bigger bets, and bad bet makers get their bet making rights restricted or in extreme cases removed. But for those of us who are managing demand side segments from a data and analytics perspective, there's also a technology version that's worth thinking about. If you track the bets that your demand side segments make and the ways in which those segments honor or don't honor their bets, you'll be far more fluent in risk assessing their requests and knowing which demand side segments need which sort of guardrails. Who brings you good bets? Who brings you bad bets? And who denies that the bet was ever made when push comes to shove and the finance department is asking about the cost of the project? So thinking about bets and then forecasting, delivering, measuring, explaining, and correcting. A lot of us are overwhelmed by short cycle ad hoc demands. This is the order taking syndrome. Most of those demands are for information products. Some of those information products require new data products or changes to data products, but those all tend to short circuit good practice. And good practice is forecasting the outcome before we deliver, measuring the outcome after delivery, explaining the gaps between forecasted and actual results, and then correcting the things we can correct for the next cycle. And also, to be clear, identifying those things that were out of our control, the salespeople who were incented to behave differently. You know, unfortunately, many, if not most, of the exercises in cost justification that I get exposed to are ones that are occurring at measure or explain after the bet is made and after the costs are incurred. There is, in other words, no forecast. And that's a failure mode. It's extraordinarily difficult to build a satisfactory cost benefit analysis, a satisfactory return business value analysis of any kind if you don't have a forecast against which to compare actuals. And we have, as you all know, this other problem. We've always had it. It's been true since we started building executive information systems in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And that is, we're working on the left-hand side of the spectrum with data products and information products, and value accrues, commercial outcomes accrue only after decisions are taken and decisions are implemented. There's a commercial decision and a commercial change. So our bets are or should always be about a commercial or a financial outcome or a proxy for them, things like reductions in cycle time, reductions in cost, reductions in risk. But because we work on the left-hand side of the spectrum and almost never have any operational responsibility for the right-hand side of the spectrum, we can't own the bet, except in one case, which I'll talk about in a little while, which is bets made on infrastructure and some kinds of data product bets. But there's another rule, and it bites many of us repeatedly, and that is if there is no one who specifically and explicitly owns the bet, guess who owns it? We do. And we own it by default because we incurred the cost. I refer to this as the misery rule. When the object is shiny, we can deploy it in high volume at significant cost and no one bats an eye. But the minute that that object is not shiny, everyone wants cost justification. And if we haven't deployed that on someone else's behalf, if there is not an owner of the bet who isn't us, we own it. And then the last rule, if the bet isn't specified in advance and in some detail, if we don't forecast it, an implemented bet cannot be successfully cost justified. This is the no goalpost rule. If we don't have any goals, it's very difficult to justify the spend. So we always target commercial and financial outcomes. What does that look like? Grossly speaking, there are only ever four kinds of commercial outcomes we can seek to achieve: cost containment, operational control, revenue enhancement, risk management. Those are the four big zones. I think even if we went back to the Raskov model from the 1940s, we'd see that that is pretty much standard practice going back that far. When we're looking at revenue enhancement and risk management, we can add in questions of loss, the loss of customers, channel partners, booking, losses in litigation, that sort of thing. When we're working on cost containment and operational control, we can add in time, cycle time reduction, whether that's time to value, time to deliver, time to decide, or what have you. And there's some conditioners on these four major topics. We can seek to avoid things, reduce things, enhance things, attain things, or accelerate things. But that's a sparse matrix. You can take that avoid, reduce, enhance, attain, accelerate model, and you can apply it in each of those four major areas, but there isn't always a value for acceleration of cost containment or enhancement of operational control. Things become very nuanced very quickly. So when I do this sort of work, the first thing I do is focus on the big four. Are we in cost containment, improved operational control, revenue enhancement, or risk management? And then you drill into the details from there. This is, in my experience, particularly a useful model when someone brings you a project and you ask the necessary why questions. Why are you doing this? What do you expect to accomplish? What does a good outcome look like? And you get back blank stares. Start here. So some things we know but do not say about this kind of work, right? I've suggested it a few times. All technology projects are bets. And that means that all measurement of technology projects is either consensus-based investigation, meaning I show you my model for what I expect to achieve, and you critique my model, and I make appropriate changes, and we agree that my model is reasonably descriptive of a future reality. And if it's not A, then it's going to be B, politicized conflict. When after the fact, when someone perceives that I have overspent and or underdelivered, there will be the demand for accountability, and that will take place in an adversarial environment. Consequently, it's a good idea to make sure that what you're doing is consensus-based investigation by forecasting up front and socializing that forecast. When everybody knows that something is desirable, no one asks that the benefits of that something be measured. A year ago, organizations were spending significant amounts of time and money putting generative AI chat applications in the hands of all their employees. And a year on, I'm spending more and more time every week talking with numinal clients who are saying, hey, I need to justify this spend. I'm getting questions about what the value of deploying this generative AI tool is, regardless of who the manufacturer thereof is. And I don't know how to do that. Well, the shine is off that object. And what we really should be paying attention to, I think, is the fact that the shine is off the object. It is possible to build that kind of ex post facto cost justification. In the case of Gen AI chat tools, it has to do with individual productivity, just like it did in the 1980s when we were deploying word processors. But we're doing it after the fact. We didn't have a forecast when we rolled all that stuff out because everybody knew that this was transformative technology. Now we're being asked for cost justification. The real point of that is people no longer believe that that object is shiny. There's always a causality barrier in technology projects. I suggested to you one example of that a little bit ago with the churn model example. There are many forces that are acting on any one pressure point in these complex systems we call corporations. Most of those forces are not technical, and we can never prove absolutely that our factors, the ones we control, were the ones that moved the needle of the metric for that pressure point. This is another argument for socializing your forecast in advance. Get agreement beforehand because it will be extraordinarily difficult to get it afterwards. An ex post facto request for cost justification when the cost is already sunk is always a signal of something else, something to which we should be paying attention. Yes, we have to respond to these requests, but we have to understand who is asking and why. All bets are underpinned by models. All models for measuring costs and benefits rely on proxies, assumptions, and false quantifications, not to mention a lot of formula work in Excel. Therefore, all models should be explicit and they should be socialized. If your first modeling and measuring occurs after the fact, if it occurs midway through or towards the end of that cycle that I've talked about, you've likely already failed. And if you're using someone else's model, you've likely already failed. So how do we make better bets? We need to ask some pretty basic questions about everything we are asked to do. Who or what is using this proposed or in production data or analytical product? To do what specifically? With what commercial or financial outcome in view? And who cares about the price and the performance of what we produce relative to the outcome? Many of you, most of you, I'd imagine, have been in a situation where you have been asked to do something and the business beneficiary has been unable to tell you what specifically they're going to do with what you're delivering to them and how that is going to move some commercial or financial needle or other. We're in the unfortunate situation where we either have to fill in those blanks for the person who is making the bet, the person who is bringing this project to us, or we have to set up an operating model in which we decline to do projects for which there are no actual bets. It's not a very attractive position to be in, but the alternative is to find ourselves holding the bet bag for too many projects. We make a lot of different types of bets, and we need different models based on the type of bet we make. So I'm going to make some comments about modeling new infrastructure or infrastructure renovation projects, new data products, modified data products, new standing information products, new ad hoc information products, and new analytical applications. Those, from my perspective, are the big categories of bets in which we participate. And this is a horses for courses problem. We cannot use one kind of model to cover all of these kinds of projects. We have to change our models as the project types change. So infrastructure bets. We make infrastructure bets and we own infrastructure bets. These are one of the few categories of bets that we own. These bets are always measured in terms of enablement. We're going to enable something at a higher layer in the stack, or we're going to accelerate something at a higher layer in the stack, or we are going to avoid cost and or risk. So all of you who are migrating away from one of those super unfortunate data appliances that were wildly popular and wildly expensive in the early decades of this century to something usually in the cloud and far more capable, are familiar with these kinds of infrastructure bets. We are moving from Greenplum to Redshift, for example, in order to avoid cost and or risk associated with staying where we are. Or we're moving to Snowflake in order to improve query performance or data legibility at a higher layer in the stack for BI tooling or what have you. We own these bets. We can only really measure the bet once those higher order activities have begun. In really well-designed cost-benefit modeling, what you find is that infrastructure bets are amortized across the projects that leverage them, because each of those projects benefits to a certain extent from a prior investment in infrastructure. Senior management, finance types typically want to see these bets forecasted. They want to see them measured. They need to be tracked over time. We spent a lot of money to move from Greenplum to Snowflake. Did we, in fact, get what we paid for? And you only find that out over a series of projects which take place over a very long period of time. But these are bets we own. New data product bets are bets that have a commercial owner and clearly defined commercial and financial outcomes. We don't own those bets. We can deliver on them, we can measure them, we can help explain gaps, and we can help correct for future iterations. But we can't be responsible for achieving the commercial or financial objectives associated with a new data product. New data products bets can be formulated against any of the four core targets in the core model. When new data products fail, in my experience, they often fail due to non-technical factors. Those begin with adoption. We can affect adoption in the first instance by paying attention to it, which we often do not do. But they end with work practice resistance. People do not want to use the value that we have queued up for them for reasons that have nothing to do with technology, or they end with poor decision making or execution. We really do need to accept the fact that when we are producing information products based on data products, and those information products are essentially painting the glass with information that we expect people to use to make and execute decisions. That value only accrues when those decisions are made and executed reasonably well. You should assume with new data products that the commercial owner is going to want distance from failed bets in this domain. A new data product bet is a fairly high risk bet in my experience. You need a business bet owner who is committed to deriving the value that is forecast before the new data product gets built. And if that new data product is not final form, if it's not designed to be used in the normal case these days by human beings, if it's a standard floating dimension or some kind of master data reference hierarchy, we should treat those data products exactly the same way we treat infrastructural bets. They are designed to accelerate or produce leverage at another layer. They have to be measured and managed differently over a longer period of time in order to be able to demonstrate that the value we forecast was in fact attained. When you modify a data product, the source of the modification request is the owner of the bet. It's usually the business, but sometimes it's data and analytics. I think when the data product is being modified and the bet is owned by data and analytics, you have to be doubly careful to make sure that you have explicitly stated what the bet is, because the modification is usually always either about data depth for constituencies you're already serving, or it's about consumer breadth. You want to expand the data product to include net new decision makers. They're best suited in either case to articulate the value component of the bet. What is this change to this data product worth to the business in terms of those 4 core targets and those ancillary objectives: avoidance of loss, acceleration of cycle times, what have you. Modified data products, interestingly enough, are usually not subject to ex post facto justification. You typically don't get asked to justify changes to a data product after you've made them, unless those modifications turn out to be long cycle or expensive. So in terms of the risk profile, these kinds of projects tend to be low risk for us. If what you're doing is cost justifying a standing information product, that is to say something that is used repeatedly by known constituents over a period of time, it has a lifetime or a life cycle, then the source of the request for that particular information product is the owner of the bet. And you can formulate those bets against any of those 4 core targets. Unfortunately, what we do quite often is build what I call FYI information products. Here's a dashboard, FYI. Here's some things you might want to know, you should want to know. It's very hard to impossible to cost justify those information products unless the owner of the bet can quantify the cost of not knowing those things. And the cost of not knowing, everyone talks about it, but when we ask them to quantify it, like how much is it worth for you to fill in this gap in your knowledge, folks have a very difficult time doing that. These are high risk information products. When the information products are focused on KPIs, some kind of key performance indicator or metric, those tend to be cost justified on the cost of confusion. In other words, the increased transaction and logistics costs associated with not having shared metrics. And that ultimately turns out to be lost time, other kinds of delay, possibly increased risk. KPI-based information products are almost always cost justified on that basis. And then when you have standing action-oriented information products, that is to say, reports, dashboards, alerts that are intended to produce action, those are cost justified on the value of the actions taken. They will always have a commercial bet maker or owner. You just have to find them. They're sometimes not the folks who are bringing you the project. Ad hoc information product bets. So I define ad hoc as used once or a few times over a relatively short period of time and then abandoned. The source of the request is the owner of the bet. I need this. I need it by next Tuesday. Okay, great. Why? What are you going to do with it? How is it going to have an impact on the business? We can't go through good forecast, deliver, measure, explain, correct behavior when the total cycle time for the project is 8 days. But what we can do is capture very clearly the essence of the bet that is encapsulated in this ad hoc information product request. We need to repeat early and often to everybody who will listen. Because of this compressed cycle time, we can't cost justify ad hoc information product requests except after the fact, which is another way of saying, if you bring us one of these, we're going to make you tell us why it's important in commercial or financial terms, and we're going to go back and check to see whether those benefits were delivered or not. I will note in passing that this, in my view, is one of the beauties of a true self-service BI environment, one in which people who would be bringing us bets are able to build ad hoc information products for themselves without our intervention. They bear the responsibility for spending their time doing that, as opposed to having us bear the responsibility for spending our time and the company's money to produce the same output when the bet is malformed, as it often is. Now, last class, bets on new analytical applications. So what's a good example of this? The churn model I brought up earlier is a good example of an analytical application. These are the hardest kinds of analytics products to build, but the bets are straightforward, and in a lot of cases, the models are too. We don't need anything like the complexities of a generative AI environment to build these kinds of systems. Many of them are more than handily implemented using good old-fashioned statistical machine learning. And having analytical applications and embedding those analytical applications in our core business processes, almost all of which these days are supported by some other transactional-oriented system, like the Salesforce automation system in this case, improves auditability, reduces handoff failures, and improves accountability for bets. When we did version 2 of this churn integrated embedded churn model, the one functional addition we made was to observe behavioral change. We couldn't observe it directly, but producing prescriptive guidance that said, in effect, you need to call distributor X on the phone, offer them a 6-month across the sheet 10% discount, and if you do that, they won't churn. We can't monitor that phone call, but we can monitor the future behavior of the distributor, and we can, because the Salesforce automation application allows us to do this, determine whether or not the sales or the distribution manager, in this case in question, looked at that prescriptive guidance. So all we did was implement a small set of otherwise unobservable functions within the application that were intended to close the gap that we had identified in revision 1, which was the sales folks, the distribution managers weren't compensated to solve the churn problem. They were compensated to sign new distributors. So we just started delivering every week to the management team a list of distributors and distribution managers who had acted on the prescriptive guidance. And doing that caused us to achieve in the second iteration the effects we had failed to achieve in the first iteration. So generally, I think because analytical applications solve a lot of the problems in that spectrum from data product to commercial change by integrating all of it, it might be a good idea for us to start moving toward a world in which we are producing fewer information products and more analytical applications, particularly if we're getting increased pressure from outside of the DNA team to cost justify our project work. So to recap, I'm sorry I'm running a little late. We need to start thinking and talking in bets. We need to forecast value, deliver the value, measure what we deliver, explain the gaps, and correct what we can correct so that the next time we're better. We have to accept the fact that every bet is underpinned by a model, that models change based on project type, and we should use an appropriate model for the project type, that we're far more likely to succeed if we socialize everything every step of the way with both the owner of the bet and everyone who cares about measuring that bet. And we always have to keep that causality barrier in mind and watch for those exogenous factors that can cause our projects to fail to deliver. As Jason mentioned, any of you who'd like a free one-on-one 30-minute follow-up session, please schedule one. I'm happy to have those conversations. For those of you in the audience who are RAN members, you can and should schedule your hour-long expert sessions, one or more than one, as many as needed when needed. I'm available. Mark Madsen is available. Other IIA experts who have a lot of experience with information economics, RBV, and cost-benefit analysis are available to help you. And for those of you who have really knotty problems, keep in mind that advisory services are available from IIA. We can assist you in the construction of models and processes. So thank you for your attention. It's the most precious currency you have, and if you didn't get value from it, please say so. I'm going to stop sharing and turn the floor back to you, Jason.
All right, thank you, Mark. Well, I got a lot of value from it. Let's dive into a few questions here. We got some good ones that came in. So first off, let's just do a little bit of a, I guess, level setting and definition of the data product versus information product in context of this presentation. So you mentioned those two different terms. So what's the difference between those?
I'll be sort of blunt, stupid, and ham-handed about it. A data product is a data set embodied in a schema, sitting in a repository, waiting for somebody to do something with it. It's a data list, it's a star, it's a normal form, it's a data vault. It is a data product. I do not use that term solely to denote data products in data mesh architectures. That is one form of product. It's data, as opposed to an information product. The information products we most commonly produce are dashboards in some dashboarding tool or other, and Excel spreadsheets.
Okay, perfect. So now let's move on to culture. The hardest mile is the culture change in the business to this way of thinking. Do you recommend making allies with any particular leaders or functions?
Well, I think it all depends on how tight you are with the finance team. In my experience, the finance team is your strongest and most vociferous ally if they believe that there is a problem accounting for the value delivered by technology projects, but that value is real. If they believe those two things, then that would be my first stop. Controllers, CFO, those folks are, as I said, natural vociferous allies if they believe those two things. The bigger question about whether or not you can move an organizational culture to a bet making culture, that's something that's got to get carried into Mahogany Row by the chief data officer, the chief analytics officer, whoever's sitting at the top of the DNA pile. And it doesn't have to be a bigger cultural change than this is how we, data and analytics, are going to start measuring and managing our technology projects. When other folks with C in their title want to know where the hell did this come from, then you refer them to Annie Duke, you refer them to Charles Koch. This is not novel. This idea has been prevalent in what I'll just call free market management systems for 20 years. But finance is key in my view. And then you have the ongoing socialization challenge with all of the business beneficiaries. Some of your business beneficiaries bring you what are essentially well-formed bets. They may not be able to articulate them, but when you probe them, they will give you good data. And those are the constituencies you want to work with, as opposed to the constituencies who bring you, I have this problem, I need the answer by next Tuesday, get busy, right? Managing those folks who want to turn us into order takers just begins with, simple conversation with someone who has relatively high EQ. What are you trying to do? When I produce this for you, what are you going to do? And when you do that, what effect is that going to have on the business? And if you get pushback, if you get, hey, shut up and do what I told you to do, then I think DNA leadership has an interesting challenge on their hands, which is, are we going to be order takers for those constituencies that insist on us being order takers, or are we going to decline to take orders? If we're going to be order takers, then I think it's incumbent upon DNA leadership to say, look, we can give you good RBV for this class of project, and we cannot give you good RBV for those situations in which we have been order takers. We rely on the commercial judgment of the people giving us the order.
Okay, great. So I think we have time for one more question, maybe two. What's the best way to measure the business value of data-driven succession planning?
Data-driven succession planning.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one before, man.
I have no idea what data-driven succession planning is, but I would love it if the person who asked that question set up a free 30 minutes so that they can take me to school on what data-driven succession planning is.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So it's really difficult to quantify the impact of time savers unless headcount reduction is a target. Any perspectives would be welcome here from you or others on the call.
Yeah. So reduction in time, activity time, cycle time, whatever time, is an exercise in false quantification, but all models involve exercises in false quantification, right? So the key isn't being accurate. So, for example, with a Gen AI chat tool, this chat tool saves 4 hours per employee per month. We need to know how we derived the value 4. We went out and talked to 50 people and they told us 2, 9, 23, and we averaged it out to 4. And we need to go to the HR organization and find out what the fully burdened cost of an employee is so that we can find out what the cost of an hour is. And then we add all that up. You can always engage in that exercise. It's false quantification. The key is to do it up front. This is how we're going to cost justify this. We're going to use this kind of metric. We're going to get this data from HR. We're going to gather that data by running a survey in order to bring people together so that if there are objections to that exercise in false quantification, they happen at forecast and not at measure when you've already sunk the cost. So model everything, use proxies whenever you have to, engage in false quantification. You spend a lot of time thinking about what's the best way to falsely quantify time, but it's always possible to do it. You just need to socialize how you do it with all of the stakeholders up front so that in some cases you find out there's a much better way to do it than the way you had planned. But in all cases, everyone who has an interest in seeing that outcome measured agrees that that is a reasonable way to measure that outcome.
Okay. All right. Excellent. All right, Mark. Well, thanks again. And thank you all for joining the call and hanging on with us. We'll be sharing the recording of this video in an upcoming email, and it will also be available on our website. Everyone should see a little feedback form here on the screen. Please take a minute to give feedback on the session. It really helps us develop timely and relevant content for you all. Stay tuned on our email and social channels for tools and resources and other content to help you with ROI challenges. And again, a good place to start is our ROI resource hub on our website, which answers questions like why doesn't traditional ROI capture the real value of analytics? What's a better way to define and measure analytics value? How do you measure value when analytics is federated? And what does it mean to make smarter bets with analytics? The Hub has exclusive roundtable peer insights, as well as key takeaways from real expert exchanges. All right, folks, onward and upward, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.